4. Operation Land Grab. With barely any resistance, Japanese troops silently invaded and took control over 2 of the Aleutian Islands in the cold Arctic near Alaska in 1942. They took 9 Americans prisoner on the island of Kiska on June 6th, and the next day they captured an American couple from Ohio and 45 native Aleuts on Attu. These 2 Aleutian Islands are so barren and remote that according to archaeologists, Attu only had about 5,000 residents in the hundreds of years before it was discovered by Russian fur traders. And even after they arrived, one Russian man stayed on the island for a full 7 years before another ship could take him home. By the time World War II came around, the islands were barely inhabited at all, but there was a growing fear of the Japanese in the Pacific, which prompted American territorial authorities to relocate the native Alu inhabitants to internment camps they'd set up in Alaska. Out of the 880 natives moved, 75 of them were killed by infectious diseases during the 2 years of internment. Unfortunately, the evacuees weren't the only ones who suffered. The US didn't bother to evacuate all of the civilians on the island. The 45 Alu natives and the American couple from Ohio were still there and were captured. When the Japanese took over the island of Kiska, they killed 2 men, captured another 7, and let one escape for a while. The man hid in a dark cave and survived by eating earthworms, which made him lose 80 pounds. After enduring 50 days of starvation in Kiska's frozen wasteland, the man, Senior Petty Officer William C. House, surrendered to the Japanese. The officer's Navy brothers had already been moved to Japan, and he soon followed them. Throughout World War II, they remained prisoners. The Japanese invaded the Aleutian Islands because General Higuchi Kichiro believed that if they controlled them, they'd be in control of the northern Pacific. Kichiro wanted to stop offensive attacks on his country. He wanted to separate and create a boundary between the US and Russia in case Russia decided to join the Americans, and he also wanted to create air bases to launch offensive attacks from. On June 6, 1942, under the command of Colonel Yasuo Yamasaki, the Japanese arrived in Kiska, and after easily capturing the island, they invaded Attu the next day. The US wasn't able to bring in ground troops until after their victory in the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands in March 1943. But they did carry out some minor bombing raids from other nearby Aleutian Islands that weren't yet taken by the Japanese. The US was ready to take action 2 months after Komandorsky. On May 11, 1943, Operation Land Grab began, sending 11,000 17th Infantry soldiers, led by Major General Albert Brown, to the islands. The Americans landed at the south and north ends of Attu, and they made their way to Colonel Yamasaki's position on the island's high ground, further inland. They didn't face much human opposition, but the island itself proved a formidable foe. This wasn't simply a march, they were searching every nook and cranny for Japanese soldiers, and they were doing so in the harsh wind and snow. The Americans were wildly unprepared for the conditions. They didn't pack the right kind of clothing, and because they thought the mission would be simple, they didn't bring enough food to last for the journey. Many US soldiers suffered from gangrene and trench foot, and they quickly lost their physical strength and morale due to hunger and the extreme cold. More troops suffered casualties from the weather than actual battles. But miraculously, the exhausted, starving American soldiers were somehow able to push the Japanese to Shikogof Harbor, where they hid in underground dugouts or caves. This small victory gave the US the upper hand. On the morning of May 29, 1943, Yamasaki led his men on a banzai charge against the Americans. His plan was to charge on the US troops and take their artillery before returning to their cliffside caves and hideaways. Then they would wait until the Japanese Imperial Army sent them back. The Americans fought without weapons at first after being taken by surprise, but eventually they used their firepower, which left the Japanese with little to no chance of victory. But a few small groups of Japanese soldiers refused to give up, and they kept fighting until July. The battle left 1,000 out of the 15,000 American troops dead, and less than 30 enemy troops survived. Meanwhile, on the island of Kiska, the Japanese controlled their herd of the mass suicide on Attu. When more Americans that were better equipped with Canadian bomber assistance and airplanes arrived in August, they dropped bombs on the enemy and stormed Kiska from 95 ships filled with over 34,000 US and Canadian troops. They expected there to be about 5,000 Japanese soldiers on the island waiting for them, but in reality, they'd already fled Kiska back in July. Even though there wasn't an enemy, 200 Allied troops lost their lives in the Nun battle. Some of them were victims of friendly fire, while others had unfortunate run-ins with booby traps. Have you heard of any other crazy operations in World War II? Let us know in the comments below and subscribe if you've liked the video so far. 3. Foo Fighters. One night in 1944, Lieutenant Fred Ringwald with the 415th Night Fighter Squadron saw something in the sky that he couldn't identify clearly. He was riding as an observer in a fighter piloted by Lieutenant Ed Schluter, with Lieutenant Donald J. Myers working radar when the object was seen hovering over the hills of the Rhine Valley between Germany and France. The men saw 8 to 10 bright, fiery orange lights in the sky. But then, at a lightning-fast speed, they moved off the wing of the plane. The airmen checked in with Allied ground radar, but they didn't register anything. Believing the lights to be some type of German air weapon, Schluter readied the aircraft to fight. But as he did this, the lights vanished into thin air. At first, the men stayed quiet out of fear they'd be ostracized, but then the sighting started to spread throughout the rest of their unit. Near Breisach, Germany, on December 17, 1944, a pilot was flying at 800 feet when he saw flashing green and red lights hovering in a T-shape. The lights seemed to follow him, but they soon disappeared. Then 2 more flight crews witnessed similar lights on December 22nd. One crew near Hagenau reported seeing 2 in a large orange glow, rising from the earth to approximately 10,000 feet. The mysterious objects tailed the fighter for about 2 minutes before turning away. According to Keith Chester's Strange Company Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II, the UFOs appeared to be under perfect control at all times. Eventually, the lights were named Foo Fighters by the airmen, which was inspired by the popular comic strip called Smokey Stover. Multiple explanations for the anomalies were given by the press, including that they were just weather balloons or flares. But these claims were rejected by the members of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, who maintained that what they saw had to have been some kind of UFO. 2. Elsbieta Strasberger. Elsbieta Strasberger lived through the Holocaust as a child. She shared her experiences from World War II as part of the National Days of Remembrance event that commemorated the victims of the Holocaust. This event is hosted by the Army National Guard. Elsbieta explained that on September 1, 1939, the Germans came and she'd barely turned a year old when it happened. In just 17 days, her family's life flipped upside down. Her father, who was a physician, went on to serve in the Polish army as a result of the invasion since he knew he'd be useful. And, unfortunately, Elsbieta and her mother wouldn't see him again until well after the war. Her mum was only 27 when her husband left, and so they went to stay with Elsbieta's grandmother. For over 2 years, they lived in southern Poland. During that time, her mother went to work in a tailor shop while Elsbieta stayed home with her family. The Holocaust survivor said that as a young child, her grandmother gave her instructions on what to do if anything ever happened. There was a gazebo in the elderly woman's backyard, and Elsbieta was told to hide under the stone benches if she ever got scared. These instructions, as it turned out, were life-saving. On June 11, 1942, Elsbieta was walking with her grandmother when she was suddenly told to go under the benches. She didn't quite understand it at the time, but heading in their direction were 2 huge Germans, and while she was safe in the gazebo, that was the last time she ever saw her grandmother alive. Amazingly, Elsbieta and her mother stayed safe throughout the rest of the war by purchasing new Aryan papers, giving them non-Jewish identities. They stayed with another woman and her child for a while but moved to Czechoslovakia when the war was winding down. Throughout this time, Elsbieta had been told her name was Barbara, but before their move, her mother revealed her real name and told her she was actually Jewish. Her father was only someone she knew from vague stories, since she was too young to remember him when he left. But when he returned, he gave Elsbieta a gift she's kept with her ever since. at the National Days of Remembrance event. As she shared her experiences during the Holocaust, she showed off a 66-year-old doll, the gift her father had given her on that fateful day. 1. Japan's Death Ray. An entire gallery of new weapons was made during the arms race in World War II. Some of them came from the edge of human imagination, while others opened new perspectives on warfare. These weapons of the New Age were bizarre and created to be so powerful that they could win the war. Even though the leaders of the world based most of their power on conventional arsenals, they all worked in secret on possible futuristic weapons. In the years leading up to the war and in the years during the conflict, these powers began developing weapons of mass destruction. Some of them were brought to life, such as the atomic bomb, but others never saw the light of day. One of these weapons was the Japanese Kugo death ray. Interestingly enough, Japan's death ray has origins rooted in the States. Nikola Tesla, one of the most brilliant scientists of all time, was one of the first men to build a so-called death ray. He called his invention Teleforce, and it was designed to project microscopic electrically charged particles. There were actually no rays of any kind involved though. Tesla's weapon was complex and included multiple mechanisms to produce electricity capable of enormous force. This force required huge static power plants, which cost about $2 million each in 1940. Tesla claimed his invention would be capable of shooting down thousands of planes at once from a distance of 200 miles away. But Tesla's idea behind the death ray weapon was peaceful. Because of the machine's immobility and dimensions, Teleforce would only be used as a defense. He believed that such a powerful weapon would make wars futile. After presenting his plans to the League of Nations and the leading powers of Western democracy, he was rejected by the US Bureau of Standards, since they believed it wasn't possible to create such an enormous amount of energy. The British, on the other hand, tried to make their very own death ray, resulting in the development of radar. The Soviet Union also made an attempt to get Tesla's plans, but the weapon was never made. But what wasn't of interest to the Allies was of interest to the Axis nations. The New York Times and the New York Sun published articles about Tesla's Peace Ray, as they called it, on July 11, 1934, which caught the attention of Japanese news correspondents. The articles were then presented in Japan, and the weapon received public attention. As the country was preparing for war in the late 1930s, General Yamamoto was searching for a weapon to give him an advantage over the US. He sought out Yoji Ito, a prominent Japanese physicist from the Naval Technology Research Institute, for this purpose. After studying Tesla's design, Yoji came to the conclusion that it was impossible to create so much energy, so he and his team turned to microwaves instead. They'd already worked on magnetrons in 1940 as part of their radar research, when Yoji decided to make a larger, more powerful magnetron. This machine, codenamed Kugo, would emit a high-power beam of short radio waves that would either cause physiological or psychological issues to nearby enemy soldiers. $2 million was invested into the project by Japanese officials, which would have been about $500,000 back in 1940. General Tsuyoshi Kusaba was in charge of the project, and a brand new lab was built in the Shizuoka prefecture. They conducted experiments on car and airplane engines, and even on animals for nearly 5.5 years. In 1943, they proved that radio waves between the ranges of 78.74 inches and 22.62 inches could cause lung bleeding, while radio waves shorter than 78.74 inches could literally destroy healthy brain cells in animals. Based on their findings, Japanese scientists believed the machine could have similar effects on humans. The first prototype was built in 1944 by the Japanese radio company. In its trial period, the weapon killed a rabbit nearly 100 feet away in 10 minutes using microwaves. A groundhog took twice as long as the rabbit to feel the effects of the machine. While they seemed to be achieving what they wanted, the situation on the Pacific Front forced all research to stop. The project showed potential and could have eventually produced a death ray, but in 1945 the weapon was far from complete, and as far as anyone knows, the Japanese haven't finished building the weapon since.
Number 8. A P-40 Warhawk fighter jet. While dredging the bottom of the Kerch Strait between Crimea and the Russian mainland in preparation for a construction project in 2017, divers discovered a submerged aircraft. After being lifted from the water with a crane, the plane was identified as a World War II-era Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighter jet. It was the third most produced American fighter throughout the conflict, with more than 13,700 made between 1939 and 1944. The P-40 that was pulled from the Kerch Strait was just one of many that didn't survive the war. It was most likely leased to the Soviet Red Army by the US as part of a Lend-Lease program, which provided Allied forces with needed military equipment. The retrieval was initiated by a local historical group. Alexander Yolkin, who led the effort, described the fighter jet as a later version of the P-40 called the Kitty Hawk. He told the press that it was most likely one of the more than 1,000 planes that participated in a mission against the Nazis. Known as the Kerch-Eltigen operation, its primary objective was to push the German forces out of the Crimean Peninsula. The pilot flying the recently discovered P-40 was likely trying to return to his base. Due to its lack of visible damage, Yolkin believes that the pilot landed it on the water on purpose and that he might have even survived the crash. Number 7. Unexploded ordnance. It's been nearly 80 years since World War II ended, yet some parts of the world are still littered with unexploded munitions, so it's not uncommon for people in certain places to come across a bomb every now and then. But it's highly unusual for someone to find dozens of undetonated explosives in one place, which is what happened to one homeowner in the Solomon Islands in 2021. While digging a hole for a new septic tank at his property in the capital of Honiara, a man came across a batch of 101 bombs from the conflict. Specialists safely removed the weapons from the scene and put them into secure storage while working to defuse them. The homeowner who discovered the undetonated explosives was unharmed, but others had been less fortunate. Just months earlier, 2 people died when a World War II bomb exploded in a residential neighborhood in Honiara. In 2020, 2 employees of an ordnance removal agency were killed during their efforts to track the locations of unexploded ordnance in the area. During the war, the US and other Allied countries dropped thousands of bombs on islands throughout the Central and South Pacific, but many of them didn't explode. While some efforts were undertaken to clean up the munitions after the war, not all of them were removed, and they remain a constant danger to people living in the Solomon Islands and elsewhere throughout the region. The Royal Solomon Island Police Force has a bomb squad that retrieves and disposes of any munitions that are discovered. Since 2011, the team has detonated more than 46,000 bombs that were mostly found in and around Honiara. But it barely puts a dent into the number of remaining explosives littering the landscape, and the bomb squad struggles to keep up with the sheer number of weapons that they're tasked with handling. Officials have warned residents in Honiara to only dig or build on property after it's been cleared by a company that specializes in ordnance removal. But the lingering problems have left many feeling as if the US should do more to clean up the mess it left behind, which continues to claim innocent lives, especially since some bomb-riddled countries have received plenty of foreign aid to pay for cleanup efforts. Number 6. A hidden Nazi bunker inside a Roman fort. One of Britain's best-preserved Roman forts, known as the Nunnery, can be found on the island of Alderney in the English Channel. It was built during the 4th century, and it went on to serve as a fort and barracks during medieval times and again during World War II, when the Nazis occupied the Channel Islands. Excavations began during the 1930s, but most of the bunker's history has only come to light in recent years. In 2021, archaeologists confirmed that it dates back to Roman times, and that it was likely built shortly before the empire collapsed as the Romans scrambled to protect their territory from invaders. With walls that were 10 feet thick, the bunker remained ideal for military use even 1,500 years after it was built. Evidence shows that the Nazis left one part of the nunnery known as the Sunroom untouched. Archaeologists are hoping it contains important clues about what happened at the site after the Roman collapse. After taking control of the Channel Islands in 1940, the Germans evicted the entire population. They built fortifications, bunkers, and tunnels, as well as 2 forced labor and concentration camps. Excavations at the nunnery are ongoing, so there may be some new secrets from the bunker that are revealed in the next couple of years. We just have to wait and see what happens. Number 5. Mysterious Journals. While clearing out his office in Madison, Wisconsin one day in 2015, the city's water utility supervisor John Kaiula discovered a stack of 10 very old notebooks. They were found far back in one of his desk drawers, and they appeared to be left behind by someone who used the office before him. He quickly realized that the notebooks contained journal entries from World War II, detailing the conflict as it unfolded. The entries included notes about the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor, the US declaration of war on Japan, and other major events of the war. It was also filled with entries detailing how the conflict affected daily life, including the challenges of getting certain materials due to wartime rationing and heightened security concerns at the workplace. The author also kept work-related notes and wrote about his personal life, including going on vacations and attending sports games and family events. Kaiula learned that the diaries were kept by a former utility assistant superintendent named Elmer Nordness, who started writing them during the late 1930s. Even as the war began, he maintained a consistent matter-of-fact tone, leaving emotion out entirely. But occasionally, he'd punctuate the entries with humor. Nordness worked for the utility until 1961, just 6 years before he passed away. The employees who were there at the time of the discovery were thrilled that nobody had thrown the journals out, and for the rare glimpse they offered into daily life during the war. Could there be ancient Roman artifacts hidden somewhere in the nunnery on the island of Alderney? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Number 4. Lost Fossil. In 1818, before we even had a name for dinosaurs, an early paleontologist named Mary Anning discovered the first complete fossilized ichthyosaur skeleton along England's Jurassic coast. It was sold to the Royal College of Surgeons in London in 1820 to raise money for Anning, who was struggling financially at the time. The fossil was still in the college's possession when it was destroyed during a Nazi air raid in 1941. It was a disappointing loss for scientists who, at the time, believed that the only remaining record of the fossil was a drawing from 1819 and discovered that it was a perfect match. Staff members at the museum thought that the artifact was a real ichthyosaur fossil. They knew that a former Yale professor, Charles Schuchert, had donated it to the museum in 1930 after buying it at the estate sale of fossil collector and dealer Frederick Braun. But unfortunately, the trail stops there, and the details of when and where Braun acquired the cast are unknown. Lomax and Massar found another cast of the ichthyosaur at Berlin's Natural History Museum in 2019. It was in better condition than the Yale fossil, leading them to believe that it was created at a later point in time. The casts enabled experts to confirm the accuracy of the drawing, which led to the discovery of some discrepancies, including bones that the illustrator missed. And it's likely not the only record of a missing artifact waiting to be discovered in museum collections. This serves as a reminder to researchers that there may be long-forgotten treasure somewhere in their collection just waiting to be revealed. Number 3. Trunk full of personal treasures. In 2022, a volunteer at the Phoenix-based nonprofit Treasures for Teachers discovered a bag filled with letters, photos, and other personal relics from the 1940s in the trunk of a donated car. Included among the remarkably preserved items were some letters written in Polish. The volunteer's daughter-in-law, Elizabeth Dysinger, speaks Polish and was able to translate some of the letters. She told news station KOLD-TV that they were written by a family in Poland, asking their relatives in Minnesota for help after their home was bombed and burned to the ground. With nowhere else to go, they spent the next 8 months living in a bomb shelter. Dysinger, who was born in Poland, explained how one of the notes said that it took many months for the family to afford a single item of clothing. The letters captured the alarming reality of what life was like in the war-torn country and how the suffering continued even after the conflict ended, when much of Europe was left in shambles. As someone whose grandmother survived a Nazi concentration camp, it was important for Deisinger to get the collection to its rightful owners. She was unable to track down the previous owner of the donated car, so she began to look for the family of the person addressed in the letters, Anna Kowalczyk. After 5 months with no luck, she went public with her search. Within days, Kowalczyk's granddaughter, Teresa Rechian, came forward to claim the items. She told ABC 15 Arizona that she had no idea how they ended up in the trunk of a donated car and wondered if they were given to a distant relative whom her family in Minnesota has never met. Teresa remembered her grandmother sending some clothes and other things to their relatives in Poland, despite being of modest means themselves. The family is still trying to figure out who donated the car, but they're grateful to Deisinger for taking the time to reunite them with a collection of letters. Number 2. Forgotten Photos. George Story was going through the attic at his home in Gloucester, England a few years ago when he found what he initially thought was an old family photo album. He set it aside to look at it later, but forgot about it until he came across it again while cleaning out his closet. The album was filled with over 100 images that were taken in the Pacific Arena during World War II. The photos were fascinating to look at, but neither Story nor his wife had any idea who took them or who the album originally belonged to. He told the Gloucester Times that he found it in a section of their attic that the couple themselves had never really been in before they started cleaning it out. By then, they'd lived at the home for over 2 decades. In an effort to get to the bottom of the mystery, Story uploaded the small photos to his computer and zoomed in for a closer look. One picture features a Japanese ship called the Kinugawa Maru, which was bombed by the Americans during the Battle of Guadalcanal. The couple Story had purchased the home from had one son, Frederick Gordon Williams Jr. All 3 of them have since passed away, but Story's pretty sure Frederick Jr. took the photos. As a veteran himself, who was drafted into the Vietnam War, Story said it's important for him to put the album into the hands of a surviving family member. In late 2022, he reached out to the press in hopes that a relative will hear about the discovery and give him a call. At number 1, Battlefield Grave Markers. On November 20th, 1943, U.S. forces attacked the Tarawa Atoll in the Central Pacific, which was under Japanese control. After a heavy air raid and naval bombardment of Tarawa's main island, Betio, Marine units launched an amphibious invasion. American boats couldn't get very close to the shore because of the amount of coral surrounding the island, leaving the Marines with no other choice but to wade in on foot from 1,500 feet away. Half of them lost their lives before even stepping foot on land, as they were met with 4,500 well-equipped defenders. The Japanese resisted fiercely, fighting almost to the last soldier. Fallen Americans were hastily buried in makeshift cemeteries that were scattered throughout the island. Shortly after the war ended, the burials were relocated to one main cemetery. In 1949, the graves were exhumed yet again and were sent to the U.S. for identification, but as many as half of the burials may have been left behind on Betio. In 2021, the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia, acquired 3 wooden crosses bearing the names of U.S. Marines Robert W. Hillard, Clarence S. Hodgson, and Bernard A. Marble, who all died at Tarawa. Due to all the disorganization surrounding the burials, Hillard's body was never recovered and Marble's remains were lost at some point along the way, but were identified again after being relocated to the U.S. Hodgson had been buried at sea. The temporary grave markers are rarely found and are believed to be the only artifacts of their kind in a museum. 5. The Swamp Ghost. Many planes have crashed in Papua New Guinea thanks to its jungles and mountains. The island has seen its fair share of war enthusiasts looking for wrecks too. Out of all the planes found, the most legendary is still the Swamp Ghost. America entered World War II shortly after Pearl Harbor. In one of the U.S. Army Air Force's initial raids, a B-17E bomber crashed in 1942. On February 22, 1942, after Japanese troops invaded Rabaul in New Britain and established a base, the bomber and 8 other B-17s from the 19th Bombing Group were sent on an attack mission. 4 of the 9 aircraft were forced to abandon their missions after experiencing technical problems. As a result of poor visibility caused by weather, the 5 aircraft that could fly were separated. The Swamp Ghost malfunctioned when it came time to drop her payload. To hit the target, the crew went around for a second pass, which was successful. Unfortunately, fire from the Japanese was too intense, and the plane suffered a hole through her starboard wing. To the surprise of the plane's captain, Fred Eaton, they landed in the middle of the Agayambo Swamp, wheels up. The 9 servicemen who flew the plane survived, but faced sickness and stifling heat. To reach dry ground, they had to go through the sharp kunai grass for about 2 days. The men were taken in by villagers and then given a place to rest while they recovered from malaria infections and insect bites. They arrived at their port on April 1st, 1942, and spent a week receiving medical treatment. After that, they were prepared for battle. 60 extra missions were flown by Captain Fred Eaton. Every time an excursion took him over the accident site, he would describe what happened to his new crewmates. The bomber remained untouched or seen for 30 years. After spotting it from their helicopter, Australian soldiers investigated. To their surprise, the plane was in good shape. Ammo was still in the guns, a flask was found with coffee inside, and even the ashtray filled with cigarette butts stayed in place. In 1979, word got out fast thanks to Pacific Aircraft Wrecks, a book written by Charles Derby. He included photos of the Swamp Ghost's wreckage, which compelled trekkers to visit the flying fortress, stripping parts of her that had any value. The plane was taken out of the swamp in May of 2016. A pilot and commercial builder from Pennsylvania named Alfred Hagen had his eyes set on the Swamp Ghost and promised to rescue it from the swampy environment. He paid $100,000 to get the B-17 export authorization in November of 2005. He then painstakingly disassembled the airplane for 4 weeks to move it overseas. The cargo was unable to be transported into the United States because of a controversy surrounding its removal. The wreck was finally approved for transport into the U.S. in February of 2010. On April 10, 2013, it arrived at Pearl Harbor's Pacific Aviation Museum after being flown to Hawaii. 4. Sullivan Brothers' grave. 5 Irish-American brothers serving together on a ship died when it sank. They were identified when the long-lost wreckage was found. The family search was brought to a sad end on March 17, 2018. The crew of the research ship called RV Petterel made the USS Juneau's discovery. Vulcan Inc., whose officials claim that the company marks the watery grave of the Sullivan brothers George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert, organized the initial expedition. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command website, family members are prohibited from serving on the same ship. In the event of a disaster, this policy spares families from losing multiple members at once. But the Sullivan brothers refused to serve unless they were allowed to stay together. Eventually, the Navy granted them permission, sending them to the USS Juneau. Unfortunately, a Japanese torpedo destroyed their ship during the Battle of Guadalcanal on November 13, 1942. The brothers and 682 of their shipmates lost their lives that day. The wreckage was an unexpected coincidence picked up by the RV Petrel's anonymous underwater vehicle and its solar pulses. The remains were spotted near the Solomon Islands, about 13,700 feet below the South Pacific Ocean. To confirm the sighting and capture wreck images, a remotely operated vehicle was deployed. The ruins of the American aircraft carrier USS Lexington and the World War II Italian naval destroyer IT Artigliere were previously found by the company's research vessels. After helping defeat the Japanese forces at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Lexington was called the ship that saved Australia. Shock swept the nation after the USS Juneau sank and the tragic deaths of the Sullivan brothers. Their mother received a letter from President Franklin D. Roosevelt showing condolences on behalf of the country. He emphasized that while they continued the fight, they would do so with the knowledge that her boy's sacrifice for the nation had not been in vain. The U.S. Navy was inspired to name 2 destroyers in honor of the brothers. The Putnam, which was under construction, got its new name, the Sullivans, on February 10, 1943. It was decommissioned in 1965, and a second destroyer was honored with the name on April 19, 1997. The ship still lives and breathes with the motto, "We stick together." Would you stick with your family like the Sullivan brothers did if you had to serve in a war? Let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe. 3. 8 rare books. 8 antique books were reunited with the library of the University of Naples, one of the oldest libraries in the world, after a soldier in the Italian countryside randomly discovered them inside a bombed chapel. To prepare for war in the 1940s, the University of Naples Library had its collections removed from the city. About 14,000 books were sent to the church and convent of the San Francesco Minturno between Naples and Rome. This collection was found in Minturno in late April of 1944 by the 88th Infantry Division of the United States Army. When the structure was damaged by shells and the roof fell apart, the friars who had been keeping an eye on the books fled, leaving the volumes unattended and left to the elements. These 8 volumes were acquired as a memento by Irving Tross, a radio operator from the battalion. The books include a Latin translation of one of Isaac Newton's original works, a book of Hebrew grammar from 1567, an edition of Boccaccio's Fiammetta from 1533, and a selection of Petrarch's 1542 writings. Eileen Shapiro, Mr. Tross's daughter, contacted the Monuments Men Foundation 70 years later. She spoke with them, saying her father wished to return the books to Italy. Mr. Tross was unaware of the repository's history. The information he did have was that they had the University of Naples marking on them. It was confirmed that the books were part of the library's collection after examining their library stamps. At a ceremony held at the Pritzker Military Library in Chicago on May 9, 2013, the Tross family officially gave the volumes to the Monuments Men Foundation. The occasion was attended by the Honorable Adriano Monti, the Consul General of Italy. On May 29, 2013, Claudio Bosignero, former ambassador of Italy to the United States, and former First Counselor Cristiano Magapinto were the two who received the books from the foundation at the Washington, D.C. Italian Embassy. 2. Eisenhower's recording. Despite the raging war of destruction, U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower directed his troops in World War II to safeguard objects of cultural and historical importance whenever they could. After the recent discovery of a speech Eisenhower delivered on April 2, 1946 at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, historians can now hear the order's justifications in his own words. The speech was given in an acceptance for being honored with a life fellowship from the museum. The founder of an arts and preservation organization that were previously mentioned, called the Monuments Men Foundation. Robert Edsel was digging through the museum archives when he found the recording. He reported that the speech had been available in text form for a while, but hearing it in the president's voice is electrifying. In his speech, Eisenhower stated that it might seem strange for a soldier who represents the profession of destruction to address a society dedicated to the preservation of human creativity. Eisenhower realized the importance of cultural treasures after seeing his men's enthusiasm as they investigated the ancient city of Timgad in North Africa while conducting some military operations. He applauded his commanders and soldiers for maintaining reverence for rare artifacts despite the anxiety of war. Jim Mosk, a worker at the Metropolitan Museum, believes the speech has been hidden away for years, languishing on a shelf. 2 books were written by Edsel on the Monuments Men, a group of 13 nations that fought tirelessly to prevent the destruction of works of art during the war and subsequently to help return the works to their rightful owners. 1. Lost Battlefield at Eora Creek. The Battle of Eora Creek experienced some of the fiercest fighting in the Kokoda campaign during World War II. To give themselves a strong geographical advantage, the Japanese set up strong fortifications along a ridgeline overlooking the town of Kokoda in Papua New Guinea. Australian soldiers fought uphill against attacks of the hardened enemy for 6 days. Against all odds, the Australians were able to flank and dislodge the Japanese, but took a high number of casualties. There are some disagreements on the exact number, but the Australian War Memorial website reports about 99 were killed in action and 192 wounded. Thanks to the sacrifice of these brave men, the road to Kokoda was clear for Australian forces. The town was at last free from Japanese occupation entirely on November 2, 1942. Kokoda track historian Brian Freeman, who is also a former army captain, has hiked and searched the area in hopes of finding signs of the battle. From his research, he knew that the Imperial Japanese had set up a temporary hospital in the area. During his time in the field, he befriended the locals. Thanks to a mutually beneficial relationship with the former head of the village, Eddie, and his son Kila, Freeman got valuable insight on the terrain, hunting grounds, and even local legends. He built huts for visitors, as well as an elementary school, and even provided transportation to Port Moresby for those who were sick or injured. Over the next 8 years, they made 25 trips through the Kokoda track, with Eddie as Freeman's guide. After Eddie's death in 2008, the role was passed down to Kila. Freeman's assumption that the Japanese maintained a foothold in the Owen Stanley Ranges during their advance period was based on several years of study into war diaries and battle maps, as well as his time spent with Eddie and Kila. Eddie told the story of the plateau, which is the home to the lost battlefield, and how the Elola village people once used it as hunting grounds. It has remained a secret to everyone except locals since October 29, 1942, when the jungle came to reclaim the spot. They talked about the impact of the battle and how the area has been completely avoided since spirits of the dead lurk there. This sparked Brian's interest, though, and he needed to go immediately. On April 23, 2010, he and a friend, David Moffat, trekked the Kokoda Trail through the jungles of Papua New Guinea to the lost battlefield for the first time. Freeman thought he would find new artifacts and, at best, remnants of a makeshift hospital, which was his original goal after learning there may have been one in September of 1942 during the Japanese advance. What Freeman actually found was beyond anything he could have imagined. Nearly 70 years later, they found Eora Creek's lost battlefield had been untouched. Speechless, they went further into the site. It was preserved with weapons, military equipment, and supplies, completely overgrown with jungle plants. With the use of metal detectors, Freeman and Moffat found ammo and helmets that once belonged to Australian and Japanese soldiers, which made them think that they were standing on the site of the Japanese defense position. His speculations that there was once a makeshift hospital was confirmed as well after they found kidney-shaped medical pans. They stayed for 6 hours and found the remains of 3 Japanese soldiers. The findings conjured up deep emotions due to the history of the last battle between the Japanese and Australians. During the Kokoda campaign, this particular fight caused the greatest loss of life for the Australians. After their discoveries on the lost battlefield and with dozens of soldiers still missing, it didn't take long to realize more could be on site. They knew they needed to make up a plan. In the weeks after the discovery, officials in Japan and Australia were told. From there, plans were formulated to respectfully identify and return every soldier home with honor, as well as preserve the battlefield. This historic discovery, dubbed the Living Museum, was a fascinating place for research to be conducted in a way that is rarely ever done. Freeman and the Trust wanted the land to be preserved in its entirety, and the locals retain exclusive guiding authority. Visitors were not permitted to the site until all of the deceased soldiers had been returned home. Thanks for watching. Have you ever seen a discovery from World War II in person? We'd love to know. While you're at it, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. See you next time. Bye for now.